Good afternoon, everyone. We've reached session number 134, Not Quite, Not White. Sharmila Sen is the author of Not Quite, Not White, and Nikesh Shukla is the author of What is Race, Who are Racists, Why Does Skin Color Matter, and other big questions. In conversation with Amrita Tripathi, they question Western citadels of color and speak of why whiteness retains the magic cloak of invisibility while other colors are made hyper-visible. This session is presented by Dainik Bhaskar. I'd like to welcome everyone on stage.
Okay. Got it. For sure. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to Sharmila and Nikesh. We are, I guess, the second last day of the festival, so we'll try and get our energy levels back up to where they should be. We will be taking questions, and I'll ask for a show of hands, from you in the audience. So we'll make this as interactive as possible. Already, I saw a hand go up already. We could start with questions. Sharmila, I do want to start with you. Not Quite, Not White is the title of your book. Do you want to start by taking us through a little bit of what led you to write this at this stage, especially? And just as a prompt, you start by talking about a little bit about the pain of smiling constantly in this, white face. Do you want to start with that? Nothing too heavy.
No, nothing too heavy, of course. Thank you, Amrita, and it's nice to be here with you and Nikesh. Well, once I start talking about this, I'm afraid I won't be able to smile at anyone, because I think one of the things that's happened is when people read that section, they just completely distrust my smile. But do you want me to talk about the title a little bit? Sure, okay. The title of the book, this is a book that's about, in many ways, about the different ways in which we think about race in America, but outside of the kind of complete black and white binary, right? And so first of all, what does not white mean? Does it mean black? Or are there, are there other ways of thinking about being not white? The not quite part of it is, of course, a kind of a story of sort of the not quiteness of immigrants, where you're kind of constantly moving towards something, but not quite getting there, which is, as I think about it, actually quite pleasing to often to the host country, because you're supposed to be striving and imitating and mimicking, but never quite replacing, right? So there are ways in which it can be very nice to be not quite.
Not threatening also,
Not
right?
threatening, of course. And then in the specific case of people from the Indian subcontinent, of course, it's a very pointed way of talking about the ways in which we think about race when we are in a country like the United States, which has a very particular history of thinking about race, which is somewhat similar to, but a little different, of course, from the UK, where, Nikesh can speak more about that. But it's something that a lot of Indian immigrants actually shy away from, And what I think is kind of aim for honorary whiteness or white adjacency, right? To be kind of getting a little closer to the dominant group. And so I wanted to kind of, explore some of those things, but it has nothing to do with, people always say, is it about this moment? Which sort of presumes that one writes a book in like 5 seconds, If only. If only. It's about 35 years of having thought about this, having lived in the US. Yeah.
So that's interesting. And Nikesh, I know we're kind of tapping you out at the festival with some of these conversations, but you are in India, and I want to just put this on its head a little bit, because Indians are notoriously racist. We don't like to talk about it. It's easier for us to listen to you talking about racism in the UK or the US, but we know we have this problem, and you see it when Indians immigrate as well. Also in the East African scenario, in the US certainly. From some of the stray comments, sometimes much more, that are overheard.
Anti-black racism
is absolutely
is sort of a hallmark of Indian racism in the U.S.
Yeah. So when you look at things like, and again, not wanting to slot you into, but this project of writers of color, or when you wrote something like The Good Immigrant, there are many different presumably conversations happening in your mind as well and in the community. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And we'll go on to some of the other issues about not just being considered a writer of color, perhaps, after that.
Yeah, sure. This is probably my third of 3 panels that I've been doing about race issues, which has been an interesting thing to kind of constantly talk about it, because I guess it all started as this desire to just be a writer, just be considered a writer. But then there's so much happening in the UK at the moment that it's really hard to look away from. And it just felt like the time was right for a book like The Good Immigrant. And it's interesting listening to what Sharmila's saying, because the whole point of the Good Immigrant wasn't to kind of... I was asked a lot about who the book was for and why I did it, and I thought long and hard about it for a really long time. But it came down to the simple thing that I'm a youth worker. I work with young people. That's what I do when I'm not a writer. I spend a lot of time sitting with young people, mentoring them, trying to help them into the creative industries, because I think it's a really, really important thing to do. It's really, really important to keep the door open for people who are coming up behind you. And the more The Good Immigrant found its success, the more I started to see that actually what it was doing was it was handing the narrative of issues around race and identity back to people of colour in Britain. And I think that was the really great thing about it, because it was sort of curated haphazardly, and I asked a lot of writers to be involved in it, and the 20 who were in the book are the 20 out of all of the ones who said yes, who delivered something on time. And what the book ends up doing is just having lots of internal conversations with different writers have internal conversations with each other, which I thought was really, really powerful. Like, you get writers disagreeing with each other, you get writers approaching the same subjects from different viewpoints, you get writers sort of giving their own personal stories, and it was just a fascinating thing to do, and I'm really excited to share the American version of that book as well, because the same kind of haphazard curation has got into it, and I think we've ended up with something just as special.
That's really interesting, and also it is so of its time, in a way that you're obviously being asked a lot about not white, as you just alluded to. Sharmila, I do want to ask you a little bit about when you write about the Calcutta years, there is it's so tangible the way you express the life of privilege, what you don't see and what you're trained not to see, but then there's sort of shame inherent in this kind of downward mobility spiral. And then when your family and you are actually immigrating several years ago as a child, that shame kind of sticks, right? Because all of a sudden it's not that cool expat, and you write about it beautifully, right? Like you're moving for economic reasons. It's not as cool as saying you're for some other reasons, the way we look at expats today. Can you take us through a little bit of that? Because presumably that would have gotten a lot of reaction from your family as well. I mean, it's quite personal.
Reaction from my family?
To read this or to read about
I don't think anyone in my family has read my book, and I prefer it stay that way. I mean, really, they know better. But I think the years you're talking about, so I guess to all of you, I should say, I grew up in Calcutta in the 1970s. So that is properly pre-liberalization India, right? And within that also, not just pre-liberalization India, but West Bengal at a particular moment, right? So, of course, I was a child and I wasn't aware of the greater kind of national or global forces, but I'll give you an example. All through the 1970s, I'd never flown on a plane, but something was flying, and years later I found out it's called Capital Flight. What was flying out of West Bengal was Capital, and it's that very period in which, and in fact, there's this wonderful book that came out about Calcutta that talks about the same period. This is sort of when the city that I grew up in is kind of becoming a version of a kind of an industrial rust belt of India. There's a lot changing in West Bengal. Of course, it's also the emergency years, right? So those are my earliest memories, is of course political graffiti. I grew up in a state that was a CPIM government, and with all of that happening, unemployment is very high, And nobody knows liberalization is around the corner. Nobody in the 1970s knew that, what was going to happen to the Indian economy, to India in 15, 20 years, right? So high unemployment, a certain kind of political moment. And in the midst of that, this is what I think you're alluding to, is of course, we're sort of a upper middle class family that's slowly sliding downward, right? So the downward mobility is, and it's heightened because, it's at a time when you can see really what if you keep sliding down, what could happen, right? And I think that, like, from that, and that's the sort of years I talk about, that kind of the utter terror and fear that you carry with you, because everything you do, whether it's about how you do in school, how you behave, who you look at, who you don't look at, everything is kind of guided by an unspoken code in the 1970s that, play this wrong and pretty bad things could happen to you, right? There isn't a kind of a sense of hope, anything's possible, India's growing richer, nothing like that. So that was, I don't mean to make it sound like a terrible time, like most people, right? You remember your childhood also with some happy stuff. The 70s were pretty cool in India in other ways, but I think for those of you here who don't know what pre-liberalization India looked like, it's like another country. I think in many ways it was another country that I left.
Yeah, and then just to take that forward a little bit. When you go to the U.S., you write about this, and it feels quite rude to ask you, but you write about it. It's a very personal story, but you do write about how you don't talk about what your father's doing for a living, but you talk about what your, you don't mind what your mother's doing so much.
Of course. Well, do you want me to read from it?
You could read from that section, and then we can talk.
Ask me about it.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, it's not rude. Why on earth would I write a memoir and think it's rude for you to ask me about it? I think
it just feels very rude because it's like, oh, we've just met like 20 minutes ago. But yes, talk about that very personal thing.
You, me, and a few thousand people who have read these very personal things. But I should begin by saying, the reason I chose to write it this way is because I think I can't sue myself, right? my own story is a way of talking about a story of lots of people, but giving it, sometimes by a very particular story, we tell a larger general story. That's just something I was trying to do. And instead of talking about someone else, I thought, well, I can talk about me, and at least I can't sue myself, and well, if people are angry at me, that's my family, right? This is, I think, the section about also sort of the difference between being an immigrant, which currently is having a kind of a good moment in the US. It kind of has a kind of, within a certain kind of liberal, progressive circles, it's become a voguish word. Suddenly, all sorts of people who I never would claim to be immigrants are claiming to be immigrants, or children of immigrants. It's like a cool thing, I don't remember that in the 1980s in the U.S., where you could be an exile, an expat. Those are better words. Yeah. Nobody was rushing to add the word immigrant to their resume, thinking that would add anything.
I blame Lin-Manuel Miranda.
What?
I blame Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Yes, yes.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Yes, immigrants, we get the job done. Yeah, but where was? Yeah,
and lots of hipster people were like, I want to get the job done. My grandmother was a third Italian. Can you be a third something? I don't know.
I don't know. Well, that would be. I do wish. If we were going to have that kind of, those videos, where was that when I was a kid? Because nobody, when I arrive in the U.S., nobody's saying immigrants. We get the word job done. This is a section where I think, Amrita, you had asked me about, where I also talk about these words, like immigrant, exile, expat, and these have kind of different categories. And I think it was last year at JLF, by the way, I forget who it was, but someone, offered a really cool way of differentiating between an expat and an immigrant. And this is how it goes. An immigrant is someone who moves into a society where you think the host society is superior to you, and the expat thinks the host society is inferior to you. So you know, obviously, I couldn't call myself an expat, but this is early 1980s. I'm about 12 years old. We waited for almost 3 years in India for our visas because Baba was too nervous to emigrate without a green card. We were making a historic leap from one continent to another, yet we were an extremely risk-averse family. Many immigrants carry these twin traits within themselves, and some even pass them on to the next generation. As risk takers, we leap far from the safety of home. Having left the comforts of home, we know all too well that there is no safety net of kinship or citizenship to catch us should we topple. This makes us cautious. We check the lock on the door 3 times before going out. We save more than we spend. We collect sugar and ketchup packets from McDonald's and cannot throw anything away. At work, we beat every deadline in the office and never pass up a second gig to make extra money. We tell our children to keep their heads down, study hard, and always look for a bargain. As risk-averse immigrants, we do not rock the boat. If you were a trapeze artist without a net below you, wouldn't you be the same way? Anything else would be irrational. Scholars who study immigrants, such as Baba and Ma and me, would describe them as the classic example of Homo economicus. Economic man makes rational decisions that will increase his wealth and his ability to buy nice things. In those early days in America, whenever people asked why my parents immigrated, I felt a sense of irritation and embarrassment. I could not say we were fleeing war or political turmoil. We were not exiles seeking political or religious freedom. We were seeking economic gains. We were seeking more money. That is a humiliating thing for a 12-year-old girl to have to repeat in a schoolyard. My parents sounded greedy, or worse, they sounded like people who had failed to be successful in the country of their birth and sought a second chance in a richer country. Because I arrived with them, I feared I too was tainted by these labels: greedy, unsuccessful, Homo economicus. At 12, I had made no rational choice, but the accident of my birth made me Homo economicus all the same. I wish we could be expats. Expats are glamorous and cosmopolitan. Cool expats like Ernest Hemingway sip Bellinis in Harry's Bar in Venice. Modern expats are the well-heeled white Europeans or Americans one encounters in cities such as Dubai, Singapore, and Shanghai. They're foreigners who have moved to distant shores for all the same reasons as a humble immigrant: higher wages, more job opportunities, greater purchasing power, and faster upward mobility. White expats often hold themselves apart from natives in the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, seeing themselves as superior. They send their children to the local American, British, French, or German school. They go to restaurants and shops frequented by others who share their tastes. They have their own clubs. In the West, we do not begrudge these white expats their seclusion. New immigrants in America, by contrast, are perceived as undesirables who bring down the real estate value of a neighborhood. The women wear strange garbs, their ill-mannered children run amok, and their grocery stores emit unpleasant odors. Meanwhile, white expats add value to their surroundings. Shanghai's French concession is chic because of the presence of white folk. European expats add glamour to the high-end restaurants of Abu Dhabi. We weren't chic expats or political dissidents with lofty ideologies. We were 3 people moving from a country with fewer resources to one with greater resources. I doubt we added glamour or value to our surroundings. Why did your parents come to America? For better jobs. To this day, this small exchange, repeated endlessly throughout my years in the United States, instantly determines the social hierarchy between my interlocutor and me. I wish I could say my parents possessed some extraordinary professional skill for which an American institution wooed them. We did not hold noble political or religious convictions that were at odds with the government of India. There was no war raging in my city, and we were not being resettled. Homo economicus has a duller, more prosaic tale to tell. Why did your parents come to America? For better jobs. The native-borns nod and feel pleased that they're citizens of a country that offers better everything: jobs, homes, clothes, food, schools, music. I would feel the same if I was in their shoes. It must feel good to be born in a country that has more wealth than other places, to have the hardest currency in your wallet. It must feel good to be generous and invite others, after intense vetting and pre-selection, to share in this plenty. Even though I had no say at all in my family's decision to emigrate, I felt my shoulders weighed down with the plenitude of the host country. This plenitude of which I was to be the grateful recipient was evidence that white people were superior to people like me. How else could one nation be so wealthy and another be so poor? One country have so much to give and another stand in a queue to receive. The inequality of nations was surely a sign that some races were morally, physically, and intellectually superior to others. The inequality of nations surely had nothing to do with man, but was shaped by providence. Why did your parents come to America? For better jobs.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Nikesh, I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy of your book for the reading, but we did talk a little bit about the one who wrote Destiny the other day. I want to ask you, in the novels, so much of our lives right now are played out on social media. I mean, there's so many times that you have to be performing sort of what your politics is, what your cultural representation is. In the novel itself, we see the difference in terms of how the sort of the patriarch of the family reacts to being in the UK as an immigrant. He's sort of head down. He will fight for his rights when he needs to, like when his son gets heckled on stage, for example. But he would it feels like he would much rather have his kids just be quiet, know their place, get by, not make themselves targets. Whereas and this is the Jani family. For those of you who haven't gotten the book, you must read it. It's going to be made into a TV production soon, so you can watch it as well. But you have the twins. One is a comedian, and one has that very interesting but ununderstandable computer job, but it also seems to be quite borderline genius. You have the kids who really do know when to pick their battles, when to raise their voice, and they just seem to know, they just seem to be born into the system. It's not that there is no racism or they don't face it, they're just not going to take it. I mean, do you think that there's a generational difference there that you'd want to talk about a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And apologies to anyone who came to that session for what I'm about to say, which may sound familiar. My dad was always of the opinion that, keep your head down, don't be seen, don't be heard, just work hard, and if you work hard, everything you want will come to you. And he bought into this, I think, 1980s conservative idea of the meritocracy, which I just, it didn't take into account that different people start from different places and have different opportunities presented in front of them. So whenever he and I would talk about issues around racism, we'd be coming at it from very, very different ends, because he lived through a time when people would attack him in the streets. Like, my dad nearly died. He had a glass bottle broken over his head by a member of the National Front and called everything under the sun, whereas the stuff that I was dealing with was much more casual. It was much more ingrained into society. It was much more like people were much smarter about their racism in the 80s and 90s when I was at school. And so when I would tell him about all these things, he'd always be like, well, this isn't racism, and then he would tell me the story of like being nearly bottled to death. And I wanted the book to kind of have this generational conversation that me and my dad have never had about these things. And interestingly, just responding to something that Sharmila said about her parents not engaging with or her family not having read her work. Like my dad hasn't read any of my stuff, and I think classic Indian dad, right?
Yes.
But I asked him about it over Christmas, and he said that it just dealt with things that he wanted to leave in the past. And he feels scared for me because he feels like I'm quite confrontational in what I write and what I put out into the world. And he would much rather that I be quiet and not be seen and not be heard. And I want to be the opposite of that because I've seen how positive change can start. And so yeah, that's
and you said he called it Mickey Mouse racism.
Yeah,
some
he
of
did.
what you had to deal with when you were in school.
Yeah.
And then there are bits in Sharmila's book as well. I mean, did you have the whole making fun of curry? And I mean, we're in a very different place in 2019, though sometimes it feels regressive based on what's going on in both your countries as well. But in terms of Indian culture or representations,
it's not regressive. It's retro.
Vintage.
It's vintage racism.
It's vintage racism.
It's vintage.
Yeah. So, but at some point, that sort of growing. I mean, and the making fun of the smells and the, what I mean? I mean, is that something that you were growing up with and basically being told that's not really as hardcore as it was earlier?
Yeah. I'm just trying to find new stuff to say that I didn't say on Friday's panel.
Well, all of these guys were not there.
It's new for the people here.
Okay,
New for
cool.
me, so go ahead.
Just because I can see one dude who was there and I feel bad for
Okay,
him.
fine. We'll move to the next. Don't worry. We'll jump. We'll get new questions in. I think, Sharmila, you do talk about this. In your book, you say the immigrant story is often written by the second or third generation in America. Right. Can you expand on that a bit? And then we're going to drag Nikesh into that conversation.
Sure. Well, I mean, I write that the immigrant story, the classic immigrant story, is written by the second or third generation because the first generation is frankly too busy just working and making it, and in many cases, their English isn't, where it should be to write a book, right? Or you're just too damn tired at the end of the day to write an immigrant story, right? And but I mean, sociologists would say, I'm kind of a 1.5 generation, right? Because I'm a child immigrant. So in that sense, I'm both a first gen, that I was born in India. I lived here till I was 12 years old, and then I moved to the US. But because I also had formative years in the US, so I was also I was shaped as a teenager, right? So it gives me some of the second gen's characteristics. But I think there's something to be told. I mean, I wrote this particular book as a first generation immigrant because I don't think a lot of these stories are written by the children of immigrants, right? And as I said, right now it's a little bit fashionable in the US to claim to be the children or grandchildren of immigrants, but so where the home country is elsewhere, or it's the place of your parents' birth, right? Where the past is seen through a different lens. But that's not how this story is told. It's actually sort of a kind of a watch me do this as it's happening, right? Not what happened to my parents or my grandparents and so forth. Yeah.
And Nikesh, I mean, I don't know if you want to comment on that. Do you?
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, when I set out to write The One Who Wrote Destiny, it didn't start. It started from a place of wanting to write about cancer and grief and stand-up comedy. But the thing that, and I didn't want to write a book about identity issues or and be that diaspora writer because I kind of felt like I'd done that with my first novel. But the thing was like when I was sort of formulating these characters and sort of trying to encapsulate the time frame of the landscape that they'd grown up in, it was like they'd grown up in like two opposite ends of like a white supremacist society, and I wanted to kind of address that. And so invariably it becomes about all of these issues, and also you look at what's going on politically. Interestingly, like just before The Good Immigrant came out, like it was like a week or two before the referendum in the UK, the B word that I'm going to try not to say because it's painful, man. I just noticed that there was both of the official Leave campaigns were so focused on immigration and what harm it was doing to the UK, And you had all of these white commentators sort of writing all these amazing think pieces and essays about the value that immigrants have given to our society. And no one was actually talking to people from immigrant backgrounds. And just one day, randomly, I tweeted a photo of me and my dad, and I wrote that my dad had come from Kenya and he'd come to the UK in the 60s, and I was hashtag proud child of an immigrant. And I did it sort of like within 2 minutes while I was just leaving my office one day, and by the time I'd cycled home, the post had kind of gone viral, and like loads and loads, well, the hashtag had gone viral, and like loads and loads of people were posting up pictures of their parents and telling their stories and reflecting on their parents' journeys and what that meant to them. And then lots of people who were saying, well, I am an hashtag I am an immigrant, and just the power of giving people like the mechanism with which to share their stories felt like a really, really powerful thing. And that's kind of like the spirit of projects like the Good Immigrant, where I want to give space to people to tell their stories in their own voices, because right now that's really important.
Yeah, and without it being prescriptive or someone else appropriating that story. Yeah. Nikesh, I do want to ask you, I mean, it's interesting. So when you come to a place like Jaipur, and I know you have maybe distant relatives in India, but your own, like your parents, like their roots might have been India, but for example, you mentioned in that famous session that, your father's, like you just said, originally from Kenya, and your mother was born in Aden, was it? Yeah. So when you come back, or you come back, for us it's you coming back, right? Because obviously India will lay claim to you guys. How does it feel? I mean, because there is a certain notion that immigrants with roots in India do take with them, and your memories would have been, say, from the 70s. So I'm going to come to you next. But when you come to a place like Jaipur, are there any stereotypes that you feel, or misconceptions or perceptions or interesting things that you notice about India today from that point of view?
I mean, I always feel like I'm slightly on the outside of what's going on here politically and culturally. Like I'm always like looking at what's going on in terms of pop culture, and like music-wise and film-wise and book-wise. But in terms of what's going on politically, I feel like I don't live here, so I don't understand the complexities of it. And I feel like I come to a place like Jaipur as a tourist because it's somewhere I've never been before. In the same way that I live in the UK, and if I visited Edinburgh, I would be visiting it as a tourist. But when I go back to Gujarat to see all my first cousins, it feels like an extension of home, and that's really nice and comfortable. And I've thought a lot about spending like a significant amount of time here just so that my children have that opportunity to sort of spend time with their cousins, because there's this sort of bad thing happened. Like I've wanted to teach my children Gujarati so that they know how to speak it, but I've had to relearn it in order to teach them it, and that's been a really interesting process for me, because what tended to happen when I was at school, I'd speak English at school and then Gujarati at home, and then after a while Gujarati would seem a bit not right, so I would start answering my mum in English, and my sister would start answering my mum in English, and then after a while my mum would just ask us in English, and so my language failed. And so what's been a really great journey in the last 2-3 years has been relearning Gujarati in order to sort of speak it conversationally with my kids.
That's very cool. And Sharmila, for you, I mean, in terms of language, but also when you come back, you have a lot of friends in...
Yeah, I mean, I've never sort of had a long gap, right? Probably the longest I've been away from India was maybe 4 years, somewhere in the mid-'80s. So I come back. I mean, after college, I started my working life in India. I was an A-level English teacher in Mussoorie in India in 1992. So I've come back a lot. I've worked here either by staying here, or my work in the U.S. has brought me here. But of course, I am American, and I have a different life. So I am not that person that I was in the 1970s. I talk about language in a different way, because sort of in a kind of lovely contrast to Nikesh's story, English is a language I learned as this was my third language, right? So I remember a time when I didn't speak English, that I didn't know English, and the acquisition of English was of course, a very important thing, as it is even now in India. It was then too, because it was tied to all sorts of issues about upward mobility or maintenance of your, class privilege and so forth. But I had a different, so I'm Bengali. I grew up speaking Bengali with my parents. I still do. I speak Hindi. I'm married to a Punjabi, so I also listen. I can speak in Punjabi, not very well, but after 25 years, nobody can speak about me in front of me in Punjabi, and so I know what you're saying. But there's a way in which I think for me, it's odd that of course I've learned English in school. I went on to college, I studied English literature, I even taught English for a while. But my relationship with English, I thought about this, really changed through my children. So, I have 3 children, and I think that for a long time, English was the language of my intellect, but it was not the language of my emotion. Was not, Raja Rao says something like that in the foreword to that wonderful classic novel, Kantapura. And lots of Indians before me have had that experience, whether they've left India or not. But I think that, one's relationship to a language isn't static. It's like a relationship to a person, that a stranger can become kin, that you can, that English was once a kind of a language that I learned artificially. But how can I say that when it's the sole language with which I love my children, I scold my children, I soothe my children, right? So it was a kind of a second round, that I think when a mother speaks to her children in a language, any language, I gave my children their language, right? Their mother tongue, which is English. So then that makes, so that changes my relationship to that language. So, it's something that I know that it's evolving, I never, when people sort of say, I haven't lost my Bengali, I haven't lost any of my Indian languages. I read in them, I enjoy it very much, But I also can't sort of pretend and say, oh, English is this kind of foreign language, I'm sort of, a little bit of an outsider. Maybe that was true when I was a teenager in my 20s. How can it be true after, that is the language through which I raise my children, So I think sometimes an immigrant experiences a country anew when they raise their children in that country.
And when you hear, you'll know. So these are all different dialects of English for us, right? Like there is you have your own dialect. And Indians, we have our own dialect, which I think we're done with the jokes over. I think the Indian English is now reclaiming that space. But let's have a show of hands, guys, for questions from the audience. And we'll start moving the mic around. We have about 15 minutes. So there's one there, that lady midway through.
Hi, I think you really very well explained your experiences as a first-generation immigrant because you were still a 12-year child, and then you talked about, your children, talked about the difficulty of teaching languages other than English. But I think over the years, a lot has changed in US and UK. The community has grown bigger. The South Asian diaspora is so big. There are a lot of language schools, community centers, and so the raising children or first generation immigrants experience is changing over time. And US or UK is also very accepting of the changes that are happening. So does your book also reflect a little bit of the changes that have happened over the decade?
Of course, the US that I first met in 1982 is not the US of 2019. No society, no country remains static. So in that sense, of course, my America will always be a little bit different from my children's. That has nothing to do, I think, about the fact of immigration. It just has to do with generational difference, right? And as I said, because, I'm kind of a 1.5, meaning that, I was a child immigrant myself. I didn't encounter the US as a ready-made adult, right? So I went through the school system. In fact, my children went to some of the same schools that I went to as a kid. So, I'm not like that kind of parent. They don't have to come and interpret America for me, right? Which is, that's a different immigrant narrative. And yes, I think there are lots of different ways lots of people raise their children bilingual, multilingual, and it's very, very possible. It was possible even decades ago. I think that every family has its own story of sort of, and sort of ways in which your children, what they understand, what they don't, do they read, do they not read. But I think what I was trying to say is this, it's a weird fact. I think the reason I wrote this is because, I have a PhD in English. I was a professor of English. So for me to say that was, I gained a new intimacy with the language, of which, I was supposed to be a professional, teaching people through my children. I'm just trying to make a point that there are many ways in which we connect with language, and we can have absolute facility with it. We can know the history of it, the literature of it, but to make it the language of your emotion, the language in which you dream, sometimes you need to have these other experiences.
Sure.
For me, it just happened to be the children.
Sure. There's a question in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I've been listening to your conversation very keenly. My name is Pooja Mishra. I'm here all the way from Pune. Now, I do understand the languages we teach our children, but I would imagine the best language we can teach anybody is the language of courage. If somebody is hell-bent on driving you outside your own country, my father served the government for 40 long years as the Chief Commissioner of Income Tax, Mumbai. And just because a certain section of society wants you to just get out of here because they want to be you, what is the language you should speak other than the language of courage is what I want to ask you.
It's a very thoughtful question. I think I want to back up a little because although I know this is about race and it's sort of tied to immigration, that has to do with the fact of the personal story of Nikesh and me. I think we'd be missing something if we forget older generations. My parents and my grandparents were born subjects of an empire. I'm the first generation in my family that was born the citizen of an independent nation, right? So I think it will be quite immodest of me to imagine I'm encountering these stories about politics, race, empire, language for the first time. It's a late 20th century of moving from India to the United States, but it doesn't mean that earlier generations in my own family hadn't encountered it, right? And there are many Indian families like that, so certainly my grandparents' generation, as it happens, I think I touch on it very, very briefly in the book. I have a kind of an odd family in that my great-grandfather was actually not born in India, although he's Indian. He was born in London and came to India when he was 21 years old. And it was a kind of a reverse Kipling in that sense, right? The son of Indians in London at the end of the 19th century who arrives his name was George Banerjee, and appears in Indian history as this kind of weird, there's a legal case of George Banerjee versus emperor. So, and I always think about the ways in which, when I was writing this book, I thought about that, because I think it's very tempting to think, right, that what we're experiencing is no one has experienced it before, right? And I was trying to think, what must have been like for a young man to arrive in India, an Indian who's never lived in India. This question you asked me is that, are you at home? Are you feeling a little distant? To arrive in India at the age of 21. And then he stayed, he never left. So I think there are all those stories as well, and you're right, the language of courage is important, but I know that it's not just ours. My grandparents' generation had incredible courage, and because they were born subjects of an empire. And without them, I don't think I could have been a citizen anywhere.
Sure, and yeah.
I have to wholeheartedly agree. The reason I do the work I do is because of people like my uncle. My mum's eldest brother, who was the first of our family, both sides of my family, to move to the UK. He ended up north. He thought he was going to move to London to move in with his best friend, who is a juggler who was going to be juggling in the clubs of London. But for some reason ended up in Keighley, which is up in Yorkshire. And there he got a job as an engineer, and he tried to buy a house in the late 60s, and when he went to view the house, he made an offer. He'd sort of borrowed lots of money from the company where he worked, and he got bank loans. He went to buy this house, and the person who worked for the building company said, "We have a company policy not to sell to coloured people." And my uncle was like, "Well, did you know that this is now illegal?" It was 1968, and the Race Relations Act had just come in the UK. And he ended up taking that company to court. And everyone told him not to do it. His family said, "Don't do this. We don't make any fuss." His company said, "Look, we've lent you the money. We don't want any negative media attention on us." His friend said, "Don't do this. We'll find somewhere else." And my uncle was like, "No, I must stand up for what's right. This law has been put in to protect us." And so my uncle is the first person to have ever brought a case of racial discrimination in the history of the UK. And my uncle, the case was dismissed from court because of a technicality. It was a brand new piece of legislation, and so mistakes were made in how it was brought to court. But in his summary judgment, the judge said had he tried the case, he would have probably found in favour of my uncle, and that discrimination had taken place. And I think about that a lot. I think about my uncle standing up for what's right at huge personal cost to himself, and doing it anyway because he believed it was right, and because he believed that the law was there to kind of protect him. And that's the language of courage that he taught me.
That's courage. If I could just say one thing, I just realized a couple of weeks ago, this is 2019, and this is 100 years ago in 1919. Everybody is thinking of 1919 as, end of World War I and all that. In 1919, my grandfather was released from jail after spending 3 years in Comilla jail. That's courage. That is the generation of our freedom fighters who spent he spent from the age of 17 until 20 in a British jail. And at the end of World War I, a lot of these young revolutionaries were released. I can certainly say whatever I have experienced, I am always humbled to know that what that generation did is something far more challenging.
There's a question in the front row.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to say to both of you, thank you.
We can't really hear you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I've been in bed for 3 days with I don't know what, but so yeah, I just wanted to say thank you both for sharing your stories. I think they're really inspiring, and hopefully they'll kind of inspire other people to share theirs. And a lot of both of what you've said resonates. And the other thing I wanted to say is the Mickey Mouse racism that your father talks about, which is exactly the same as my father talks about. It's quite painful, isn't it, actually? And if you have a whole lifetime of it, it kind of builds up. And I feel with the dirty B word, I don't know about you, but it feels like in the last couple of years, the kind of those microaggressions of racism have just grown so big that the amount of times I've sat around a table with friends and found myself laughing at things that I just find, just kind of quite racist. So I guess I've got a bit of a two-part. Firstly, do you think that the levels of racism have risen in the last few years? And secondly, how do you negotiate it when you're sitting around a table with your non-white friends? What do you do? Because for me, smiling is just not enough anymore.
So controversially, I don't think that there's been an increase in racism.
I agree.
I think it's just there's been an emboldening, and it's just moved out into the open a lot more. It's gone from behind closed doors and dog whistles and gaslighting to being overt again. I I told a story a few days ago. Told a story at my amazing Brexit panel yesterday, which was fun to do, about a guy coming up to me at a train station and just saying he could take my passport away if he wanted to, and it was England for the English, and just because I was born here doesn't make me English. And he said it in a really casual, matter-of-fact way. And he's probably always thought that. Like, Brexit hasn't added 52% more racists to the world. I think it's just emboldened a lot of people to move their views out into the mainstream. There's this thing called the Overton Window, which is like the window through which political discourse is seen at any given time. And or the normal political discourse is seen at any given time. So when you have things in the UK on the BBC where, for balance, they put people like Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen on the TV all of the time, it shifts the Overton window over towards the right, and it makes people think that the lens of normal political discourse is right of centre. And that is happening more and more and more. And it's normalising people's shitty opinions, and and like this, like far right, like commentators are sort of clever about it because they turn things like racism into a free speech issue, or they say, well, the left are the real Nazis because they won't even come to the debate. And I'm always of the opinion that things like racism aren't an issue of debate.
And what about your personal, what she was asking about, when you're sitting with friends, and how do you negotiate those conversations?
Lose those friends. Cut those ties, burn those bridges. I don't know. I'm joking. It depends on the situation. If I feel like it's a conversation worth having, then I'll have that conversation. I will always express my distaste, but how I express my distaste depends on the context of the conversation and who it's with and whether it's a friend I want to keep. There's a great video by a guy called Jay Smooth who talks about when you're having these conversations, there's the difference between telling someone that they are a racist and what they said was racist, because one pushes them to an extreme that they can then deny, and the other invites a conversation about the specific infraction, and I think it's an important distinction to make. If you go straight to "you are a," then it's then a really hard conversation to navigate. But if you go, listen, you're my friend, but what you said was racist or problematic or what have you because of these specific things, it invites a conversation.
I think, I'll come at it from a slightly different angle, of course, because I live in the United States, and I have no patience for the kind of in these times, any kind of conversation that begins these days with in these times, because to me that betrays a really, really limited idea of what U.S. history is, right? And so we have to, we can be critical of certain things maybe that are going on now, but we would also be naive to think that there was some wonderful past. I mean, what period of the United States would I like to go back to, me personally? Yeah. Certainly not the 1950s, because from 1790 to the 1950s, most non-whites couldn't become naturalized citizens. So we have to kind of remember of where the United States had been. And again, which is not to say that you just have to say because the past was really shitty, so even little gains are okay. But it is important to know our history and to not kind of get into this is the worst it's ever been. I think it's also a particular kind of privilege. People who are discovering racism for the first time in 2016, I kind of envy them. I don't know, wherever they were living in the US, I wish I was living there too.
I think we have one last quick question though. We have time for one last question.
Hello, ma'am. You have mentioned about Raja Rao and Raja Rao's Kanthapur. When we read the novels like Raja Rao or Mr. Naipaul, as a reader, I feel that the root is inside your mind. In your writing, how you have depicted and how you are close to your roots in your writing, what you feel? What sort of
roots
opinion?
in your writing?
I want to say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something about your roots in your writing, but you have to make it really quick. No pressure.
I'm sorry. That I think when I mentioned the Kantapura and Raja Rao, it was just to remind us that all these ideas have existed before. That I was just trying to say that they, in terms of are they my roots? Sure. But Raja Rao himself, by the way, in Kantapura, and the story of V.S. Naipaul is a little different because I'm making a point here about language, right? When Raja Rao's writing Kantapura in the 1930s, he himself is drawing on, in that foreword that I mentioned, he writes, he said, like Sanskrit and Persian were once. So India has a history, a multilingual history that again goes back centuries, right? This idea that you can have one language be the language of your intellect, another the language of your emotion, is not a new phenomenon, is not a post-colonial phenomenon, it's not an immigrant phenomenon. We had that with languages like Sanskrit and Persian hundreds of years before, and that's what Raja Rao was drawing on, and that's in that moment I was drawing on that to say we're all building on very long literary roots.
So here's how you can continue the conversation. Buy their books. The bookstore is right there. They will be doing a signing at the signing area. A big round of applause for both Sharmila and Nikesh.